Snow has a way of keeping secrets. It falls quietly, without any announcement, and it covers whatever it finds. Driveways, mailboxes, footprints. The whole record of an evening can disappear under a few inches of white, and by morning the world looks new and blank, as if nothing at all had happened the night before. In the early hours of January 29th, 2022, snow was falling on a small town south of Boston called Canton, Massachusetts. It fell on quiet colonial houses and old stone walls, on hockey rinks and church steeples, on a modest suburban street called Fairview Road. It fell steadily, then heavily, then in the near whiteout of a proper New England blizzard. And somewhere beneath that falling snow, on the front lawn of a house at 34 Fairview Road, a story was beginning that would take more than 4 years to unfold. Nobody in Canton knew it yet. Most of the town was asleep, but that snowy lawn would eventually become one of the most closely examined patches of grass in the history of American criminal justice. Millions of people would come to know the names of the ordinary people connected to it. And a 41-year-old woman named Karen Reed, who at that moment was at home in the next town over, was about to find her entire life pulled into a case that would be argued in 2 long trials, debated on street corners and computer screens across the world, and remembered as one of the strangest legal sagas New England has ever produced. Tonight, we're going to walk through that story slowly, from the beginning. There's no need to rush, and there's no need to remember every name or every date. This is a story you can simply let unfold the way the people of Canton experienced it, one quiet development at a time. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's go back to a small town in Massachusetts in the last days of January, in the winter of 2022. Canton is the kind of place people describe as a good town to raise a family. It sits about 15 miles southwest of Boston, tucked along the edge of the Blue Hills, with a population of around 25,000 people. It has a commuter rail station, a little downtown with restaurants and an ice cream shop, youth sports leagues, and a long history that stretches back to the days when Paul Revere himself operated a rolling mill along the Neponset River there. It is, in most ways, an unremarkable and pleasant American suburb. Like a lot of towns around Boston, Canton is thick with police families. Officers from Boston and the surrounding departments live there, coach there, drink coffee there. Firefighters and paramedics and dispatchers all know one another. People stay for generations. Kids grow up together, play hockey together, and end up working together. It's a close community, and in the winter of 2022, that closeness was simply a fact of life, the pleasant background hum of a small town. Later on, that same closeness would become one of the central questions of this entire story. But we're not there yet. One of the people who spent time in Canton was a man named John O'Keefe. John was 46 years old that winter, a 16-year veteran of the Boston Police Department. People who knew him described him as easygoing, a little shy, dependable, the kind of man who showed up. And John's life had already been shaped by more grief than most. Years earlier, his sister had passed away from cancer, and not long after that, her husband died as well. Their 2 young children, John's niece and nephew, were left without parents. John took them in. A single man, a working police officer, He became, in every practical sense, their father. He raised them in his home in Canton, drove them to practices and games, made the school lunches, kept the household running. Whatever else anyone would ever say about the events of that January, everyone agreed on this. John O'Keefe was a good uncle, and those kids were the center of his life. For about 2 years, John had been in a relationship with Karen Reed. Karen was 41, a professional woman with a serious career. She worked as an equity analyst at Fidelity Investments, and she also taught finance as an adjunct professor at Bentley University. She lived in Mansfield, a town not far from Canton. She was sharp, direct, well-spoken, the kind of person comfortable standing in front of a lecture hall. She had grown close to John's niece and nephew, helping out with the routines of the household, and by most accounts, the relationship had real warmth in it. It also had strains, the ordinary and not so ordinary frictions of 2 adults in midlife trying to blend complicated lives. By that January, things between John and Karen had been up and down. None of that was unusual. Couples argue, couples drift, couples find their way back. There was nothing about John and Karen in late January of 2022 that would have made anyone predict what was coming. Friday, January 28th, 2022, was a cold, grey day, and everyone in eastern Massachusetts knew what was on the way. Meteorologists had been talking about it all week. A major winter storm, a nor'easter, was bearing down on the region, expected to arrive overnight and bury the coast in a foot or 2 of snow. It was the kind of forecast New Englanders take in stride. You do your errands, you fill the gas tank, you make sure there's milk and bread in the house. And then, if you're so inclined, you go out for a few drinks before the world shuts down for a day or 2. That's roughly what John and Karen did. That evening, they went out in Canton. They started at a bar called C.F. McCarthy's, a friendly local spot, where they had drinks and crossed paths with familiar faces. Later in the evening, they moved on to another Canton establishment, the Waterfall Bar and Grill, where a loose gathering of friends and acquaintances had formed. Many of the people there that night knew each other through the usual small-town channels: family, work, and, in several cases, law enforcement. Among the group at the waterfall that night was a man named Brian Albert, a sergeant with the Boston Police Department, a long-time Canton presence, and a former boxer with deep roots in the town. His sister-in-law, Jennifer McCabe, was also part of the extended circle that evening. Jennifer was a Canton mother, well known around town, and she was friendly with John O'Keefe. There was also a man named Brian Higgins, a federal agent with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, who knew the group and who, as would come out much later, had exchanged some flirtatious text messages with Karen in the weeks before that night. For now, though, it was just a bar on a Friday night before a storm, filled with people having drinks, watching games on the televisions, and talking about the snow that was coming. As the night wound down, an invitation went around. Brian Albert and his wife, Nicole, lived nearby at 34 Fairview Road, and people were heading over there to keep the evening going. It was the kind of casual after-party that happens in towns like Canton all the time. John and Karen were invited along. Sometime after midnight, in the very first minutes of Saturday, January 29th, Karen drove the 2 of them to Fairview Road in her car. a black Lexus SUV. The snow was beginning. What happened over the next several minutes would be examined second by second for years to come by state police investigators, federal agents, accident reconstruction experts, data analysts, 2 juries, and countless ordinary people watching from home. So it's worth saying plainly, right at the start, what is agreed upon and what is not. What's agreed is this. Karen's Lexus arrived outside 34 Fairview Road around 12:30 in the morning. John got out of the car. Karen did not go inside. At some point, she drove away, back to John's house on Meadows Avenue in Canton. And eventually, she fell asleep there. Inside 34 Fairview Road, the after-party carried on for a while, and the people who were inside the house would all later say the same thing. John O'Keefe never came through the door. No one inside, they said, ever saw him that night. And that's essentially where the agreed-upon facts of that half-hour end. Everything else about those minutes on Fairview Road would become contested ground. But again, we're getting ahead of ourselves. On the night itself, nothing seemed wrong to anyone. The party wound down. The guests went home. The snow kept falling, thicker and thicker, and Canton went to sleep under the gathering storm. At John's house on Meadows Avenue, Karen woke in the early morning darkness, sometime around 4 or 5 a.m., and realized John wasn't there. His side of the bed was empty. She checked her phone. She began calling him over and over. The calls went unanswered. She left voicemails, and some of those voicemails were angry, the raw, unfiltered messages of a woman who was some combination of upset, hurt, and increasingly frightened. She would say later that she had been drinking the night before, that her memory of the drive was imperfect, and that as the minutes passed with no word from John, a cold dread began to set in. A little before 5 a.m., Karen started calling people. She reached Jennifer McCabe, who had been at the party at the Alberts' house. She also reached another friend, a woman named Kerry Roberts. Karen was frantic on the phone. John hadn't come home. Something was wrong. In the pre-dawn darkness, with the blizzard now fully arrived, and the roads disappearing under snow, the 3 women set out to look for him. They checked around, they drove, and eventually, sometime around 6 in the morning, they made their way to Fairview Road, the last place anyone knew John had been. The snow by then was falling hard, wind-driven, several inches deep, and piling up fast. Visibility was poor, and it was there, on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road, near the flagpole, that Karen spotted something in the snow. A shape. A shadow of a figure, already half buried. It was John. He was lying on his back on the lawn, covered in snow, unresponsive, terribly cold. Karen ran to him. What happened in the next few minutes came from the accounts of the people who were there, and the first responders who arrived. Karen was screaming, hysterical, trying to clear the snow off him. Jennifer McCabe called 911. Kerry Roberts and Karen attempted CPR on the frozen lawn while they waited. Karen, by several accounts, kept crying out in the chaos, and some of the firefighters who arrived would later testify that among the things she said, over and over, were words to the effect of, "I hit him." Karen and her defenders would always insist that whatever she said in those minutes was the anguished, questioning cry of a woman in shock, asking whether she could possibly have hit him, searching her own foggy memory in the worst moment of her life. Not a confession. Those few words, spoken on a snow-covered lawn at dawn, would eventually be argued over by some of the best trial lawyers in America. But in the moment, they were just sounds in a blizzard, nearly lost in the wind. The ambulance took John to Good Samaritan Medical Center in Brockton. He was pronounced dead that morning. The medical examiner would later find that he died of blunt force trauma to the head together with hypothermia. He had a fractured skull and bleeding in his brain, and a pattern of scratches and abrasions on his right arm. Notably, for a man who prosecutors would soon claim had been struck by a 5,000-pound SUV. He had no broken bones in his arms or legs, no shattered pelvis, no significant bruising on his lower body, none of the classic injuries that trauma doctors associate with a pedestrian hit by a vehicle. That quiet medical detail would sit at the very center of everything that followed. John O'Keefe's death was, on that morning, a local tragedy. A Boston police officer, a devoted uncle, found dead in the snow in his own town. The news rippled through Canton the way news does in small towns, phone call by phone call, over coffee, in grocery store aisles. His niece and nephew, the two children he had raised, had lost a third parent. Whatever else this story would become, it began, and in some sense always remained, the story of a good man who died far too young on a cold night, and of two kids who deserved better from the world. The investigation began at once, and here the story takes its first quiet turn, one that seemed like nothing at the time. Because John was found on the property of Brian Albert, a Boston police officer, and because John himself was a Boston police officer, the Canton Police Department stepped aside, and the case went to the Massachusetts State Police detectives, assigned to the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office. That's a normal arrangement in Massachusetts. State police detectives attached to each county's district attorney handle death investigations. The district attorney of Norfolk County was a man named Michael Morrissey, a longtime fixture of the county's legal establishment. The lead investigator assigned to the case was a state trooper named Michael Proctor. He was a Canton guy himself, raised in town, and his family, as it would emerge much later, had personal connections to some of the very people who had been at 34 Fairview Road that night, including ties of friendship between his family and the Albert family. On the morning of January 29th, 2022, nobody outside a small circle knew that. Trooper Proctor was simply the detective on the case, working a death investigation in a blizzard. The investigation moved remarkably quickly. Within hours, attention had settled on Karen Redd. She had been the last known person with John. She had said those words on the lawn. And when investigators looked at her black Lexus SUV, they found that its right rear tail light was broken, cracked, and missing pieces. Later, investigators reported finding fragments of red and clear plastic in the snow near where John had lain. Pieces that, they said, matched Karen's broken tail light. And in the days that followed, they reported something more. Tiny traces of John's DNA, they said, on the damaged tail light itself. To the investigators, a picture came together with almost startling speed. In their telling, Karen and John had been fighting. She had dropped him off, and as she pulled away, angry and intoxicated, She had struck him with the rear of her SUV, sending him to the frozen ground, and then driven off into the storm, leaving him to die in the snow. It was a simple story, a grim, familiar shape of a story. A relationship gone sour, alcohol, a moment of rage, a cover of darkness and snow. On February 1st, 2022, just 3 days after John's body was found, Karen Red was arrested. She was charged with manslaughter, motor vehicle homicide, and leaving the scene of a collision causing death. She stood in a courtroom that week, a college professor and financial analyst with no criminal history, and pleaded not guilty. Bail was set, and she went home to await whatever came next. 3 days. It's worth letting that settle for a moment, because so much of what followed traces back to it. Complex death investigations often take weeks or months before charges are filed. Accident reconstruction alone, done carefully, is slow work. Here, in a case with no eyewitness to any collision, no video of any collision, and a snowstorm that had buried the scene almost as soon as it was found, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts had settled on its answer before John O'Keefe had even been laid to rest. From the perspective of the investigators, it was simply an obvious case, quickly solved. From the perspective of Karen Reed, and of the many people who would eventually rally to her side, those 3 days were the whole problem. A conclusion reached first, with the investigation arranged afterward around it. Months passed, and then, in June of 2022, the case grew heavier. A Norfolk County grand jury indicted Karen on an upgraded charge, murder in the 2nd degree. Prosecutors now alleged not merely recklessness, but that she had acted with malice. The woman who had knelt in the snow doing CPR on the man she loved was now formally accused of murdering him. Karen hired lawyers, and she hired serious ones. Over time, her defense team came to be led by David Yannetti, a veteran Massachusetts defense attorney, and Alan Jackson, a famous trial lawyer from Los Angeles, a former prosecutor known for handling some of California's most complicated murder cases. And as her lawyers began doing what defense lawyers do, requesting records, interviewing witnesses, hiring their own experts, examining the physical evidence, they began, piece by piece, to form a very different theory of what had happened on Fairview Road. Their theory was this: Karen Reed never hit John O'Keefe at all. John, they argued, had gone toward that house, and something had happened to him that night that had nothing to do with Karen's Lexus. The injuries on his body, they said, didn't look like a car strike. The scratches on his arm, they suggested, looked like something else entirely, perhaps the marks of an animal. The Alberts, it turned out, had owned a German shepherd named Chloe. The fractured skull with no lower body injuries looked, to their experts, more like the result of a fall or an altercation than a collision with an SUV. And the people inside that house, the defense noted, were not ordinary witnesses. They were police officers and their relatives, investigated by state police detectives from their own extended world, in a county where everyone seemed to know everyone. In other words, the defense would come to argue, Karen Reed wasn't a murderer. She was, they said, a convenient outsider, the last one seen with John, the one with the broken tail light, the one who wasn't from the tight-knit circle of Canton law enforcement families. And the investigation had wrapped itself around her within hours, and never seriously looked anywhere else. Now, it's important to say, gently and clearly, that the people inside that house have always denied, completely and consistently, that anything happened to John O'Keefe inside or around their home. They testified under oath, at length, in 2 trials, that John never entered the house, that there was no fight, and that they had nothing to do with his death. No one who was in that house has ever been charged with anything connected to it. The defense theory remained exactly that, a theory, and in Karen's second trial, the judge would not even permit her lawyers to name those individuals as alternative suspects in front of the jury. What can be said, as simple fact, is that 2 very different stories about the same snowy half-hour came into being, and that the collision between those 2 stories would consume Massachusetts for years. For a long while, though, the case stayed relatively quiet. Through the rest of 2022, it moved slowly through the courts, hearing by hearing, the way cases do. Karen lived under the weight of a murder charge. John's family grieved. Canton went about its business, its opinions mostly private, its conversations mostly kept to kitchens and bar stools. That quiet would not last, because in the spring of 2023, a blogger from Worcester with a strange pen name was about to pick up the case. And when he did, the story of Karen Reed would stop being a local matter and become something Massachusetts had truly never seen before. But that, and the trials that followed, is where our story continues. End of part 1. Part 2. Before we go on, one quiet word about the road ahead. This next stretch of the story is where the disputes begin, the competing claims, the contested timestamps, the accusations that flew in both directions. Some of what you're about to hear was alleged by one side and denied, under oath, by the other. And much of it is still being fought over in courtrooms to this very day. So as we walk through it, you will hear the story told the way the record tells it. What the defense argued, what the witnesses answered, what the documents showed, and where the truth remains, honestly, unsettled. You don't need to decide anything tonight. You can simply listen, the way you'd listen to someone describing a long storm from the safety of a warm room. By the spring of 2023, Karen Reed had been living under a murder charge for about a year. The case was moving slowly through the Norfolk County courts, mostly out of public view. And then, in April of that year, everything changed because of a blogger. His name was Aidan Kearney, though almost nobody in Massachusetts called him that. For years he had written under the name Turtle Boy, running a scrappy, irreverent, often abrasive local blog out of central Massachusetts that specialized in small-town scandals and the kind of stories the big papers didn't touch. He was loud, he was polarizing, and he had a devoted readership. People loved him, or couldn't stand him, and he seemed comfortable either way. That April, Kearney began publishing a series of articles about the Karen Reed case. He called the series The Canton Cover-Up, and in it he laid out in blunt and relentless detail the defense's alternative theory of the case and his own investigation into the people and relationships surrounding it. He wrote about who was in the house that night. He wrote about the family ties between the lead investigator and people connected to the case. He wrote about the evidence collection, the timelines, the phones. Article after article, week after week, He hammered at a single question. What if Karen Reed didn't do it? It's fair to say that no one, not the prosecutors, not the defense, probably not even Kearney himself, anticipated what happened next. The series caught fire. Readers who had never heard of Canton, Massachusetts, were suddenly following every filing in the case. A movement began to form, and it took on a color, pink, Karen's favorite, and a slogan, Free Karen Reed. Supporters organized what they called rolling rallies, caravans of cars decorated in pink, driving through Canton, honking, waving signs. They stood outside the courthouse in Dedham in growing numbers. They filled comment sections and message boards. A local death investigation had become, seemingly overnight, a cause. Now Kearney's methods were aggressive, and they came at a cost. He confronted witnesses in person and on camera, showed up at their public appearances, and named them constantly in his writing. In October of 2023, he was himself arrested and charged with witness intimidation and harassment connected to that conduct, charges brought by a special prosecutor appointed through the same district attorney's office that was prosecuting Karen. Kearney pleaded not guilty and insisted loudly that he was a journalist being punished for embarrassing powerful people, and his charges became yet another front in the widening war. Those charges, like so much in this story, would drag on for years. The people he wrote about, for their part, described his attention as a campaign of harassment that upended their lives, and in time, several of them would sue both Kearney and Karen Reed for defamation over the cover-up claims themselves. A suit filed in 2026 that is still pending as of this telling, and in which they maintain that everything said about them was false. Both of those things can be held gently in mind at once. A movement that believed it was exposing an injustice, and a group of families who insist they were innocent people caught in a storm they never asked for. The district attorney, Michael Morrissey, did something in August of 2023 that veteran court watchers found extraordinary. He recorded a video statement released to the public in which he denounced the harassment of the witnesses in the case and declared flatly that the claims of a cover-up were baseless. Prosecutors almost never comment publicly on pending cases, and here was an elected district attorney doing exactly that on camera. To his supporters, it was a decent man defending ordinary citizens from a mob. To Karen's supporters, it was something else. The head of the office prosecuting her, publicly vouching for the very people her defense intended to point at. Either way, it told everyone watching just how unusual this case had become. And there was something else moving beneath the surface that most of the public didn't know yet. Sometime in 2023, the United States Attorney's Office in Boston, the federal prosecutors, quietly opened an investigation of their own. Not into Karen Reed, into the investigation itself, into how the Massachusetts State Police and the local authorities had handled the death of John O'Keefe. A federal grand jury heard evidence. Federal investigators retained an independent crash reconstruction firm, a company called AIRCCA, with no ties to either side, and asked its experts a simple question. Do John O'Keefe's injuries look like he was hit by a car? When the federal materials were turned over to the state case in the spring of 2024, the answer landed like a stone in still water. The independent experts had concluded that the injuries were not consistent with being struck by a vehicle. No broken bones in the legs. No bruising where a bumper would strike. The damage to the tail light, in their analysis, didn't line up with an impact against a human body in the way the prosecution described. The federal government never charged anyone, and its investigation would eventually close without any charges at all. But the fact that it had existed, that federal prosecutors had looked at a state murder case and hired their own scientists to test it, was itself remarkable. Cases like that can be counted on very few fingers. So that was the landscape as the first trial approached. A defendant who insisted she was innocent, a grieving family who believed she was guilty, a groundswell of pink-clad supporters, a blogger under indictment, a district attorney on video, and a federal grand jury in the background. On April 29th, 2024, in the old courthouse in Dedham, Massachusetts, the Commonwealth versus Karen Reed finally began. The trial ran for more than 8 weeks, one of the longest anyone could remember in that courthouse. The prosecution, led by an assistant district attorney named Adam Lally, called dozens of witnesses and built its case on the pieces you already know. The broken tail light, the plastic fragments recovered from the lawn, the DNA, the angry voicemails, the words witnesses said Karen cried out in the snow. The story the Commonwealth told was straightforward. A relationship curdling, too much to drink, a 3-point turn in the dark, a reversing SUV, a man left dying in a blizzard. The defense told the jury an entirely different story, and they told it from their opening statement onward. Karen Red, they said, was framed. And over the following weeks, they set about pulling on every loose thread they could find in the Commonwealth's case. There were, it turned out, a great many threads. There was the crime scene itself, or rather, the way it had been processed. The lawn at 34 Fairview Road was never secured the way textbooks say a death scene should be. In the hours after John was found, with the blizzard still raging, officers collected evidence using what they had on hand, which turned out to be red plastic drinking cups, the kind you'd see at a cookout, and a supermarket shopping bag. Later, a leaf blower was used to clear snow in the search for debris. Pieces of tail light were not all found at once. Some were recovered days later, on return visits to a scene that had sat unguarded, open to anyone, in the intervening time. None of that, by itself, proved anything sinister. Police departments improvise in blizzards. But for a defense, arguing that evidence had been assembled to fit a conclusion, every red cup was a gift. There was the tail light itself. The defense argued that the damage to Karen's Lexus hadn't come from striking John at all. They pointed to video from a home security camera at John's own house showing that early that morning, in her frantic state, Karen had clipped John's parked car while maneuvering her SUV, and they argued the tail light was further damaged then or later, and that the most incriminating fragments appeared at the scene only after Karen's vehicle was already in police custody. The Commonwealth rejected all of that, and its witnesses testified the damage and the debris told one consistent story. 2 sets of experts looked at the same cracked plastic and saw 2 different worlds. There was the phone data, and here the story becomes almost strangely intimate, because so much of it came down to the quiet machines we all carry in our pockets. John's own phone recorded its last activity a little after 12:30 that night, and then sat still. Prosecution experts pointed to the phone's battery temperature, which fell steadily through the night, hour after hour, in a long, slow curve, as evidence that the phone and John had been outside on that lawn from shortly after Karen's car pulled away. The defense pointed to other data on the same phone. Movement the device seemed to register in those final minutes, which they argued could reflect John walking, perhaps climbing steps, perhaps entering somewhere before everything went still. The same numbers, read by candlelight from two different directions. And then there was the search. If this case has a single artifact that people will still be arguing about decades from now, it is a Google search typed into Jennifer McCabe's phone, misspelled in the way things are misspelled when fingers are cold or shaking. Hose long to die in cold. How long to die in the cold? No one disputes that the search existed, or that it was made on her phone. What the two sides fought over, bitterly, through 2 trials, was when. A digital forensics expert retained by the defense examined the phone and testified that, in his reading of the data, the search was made at 2:27 in the morning, hours before John's body was found, at a time when, if true, no innocent person should have had any reason to wonder how long a man could survive in the snow. If that timestamp was right, it changed everything. Jennifer McCabe testified, under oath, in both trials, that it was not right. She swore that she made that search at around 6:23 in the morning, minutes after they found John on the lawn, because Karen, in her panic, asked her to look it up. And the Commonwealth brought its own digital experts, specialists in exactly this kind of cell phone forensics, who testified that the 2:27 timestamp was a technical ghost, an artifact left behind by a browser tab that had been opened hours earlier for something entirely innocent, a search about a youth basketball game, and then reused. In their analysis, the phone's deeper records showed the fateful search happening exactly when McCabe said it did, just after 6:23 a.m. So there it sits, one search, 2 timestamps, experts on both sides with credentials and slide decks, and a woman who has sworn from the witness stand that she did not search those words in the dead of night. She has never been charged with anything. She and her family have said the accusation destroyed years of their lives, and their defamation suit over these very claims is still working its way through the courts. The kindest, truest thing that can be said, here in the quiet, is that a jury heard all of it, both timestamps, both sets of experts, and in the end declined to convict Karen Reed. What the search proves, if it proves anything, belongs to the long list of things this case never fully resolved. There were other threads too, and the defense pulled each one before the jury. There was a phone call placed at 2:22 in the morning from Brian Higgins, the federal agent who had exchanged flirtatious messages with Karen in the weeks before that night, to Brian Albert's phone, deep in the small hours when both men said they were asleep, or the call was an accidental dial, unanswered and meaningless. There was the fact that Higgins later disposed of that phone, which he explained as an ordinary upgrade, and the defense painted as something darker. There was the fact that, in the year after John died, the Alberts sold the house at 34 Fairview Road and found a new home for their dog, Chloe, the German Shepherd, whose existence mattered because defense medical experts testified that the parallel scratches on John's arm looked to them like the marks of an animal, perhaps a dog, and not like road rash from any pavement. The Alberts said the move, and the dog had innocent explanations: downsizing, family circumstances, nothing more, and that no dog of theirs bit anyone that night, because, they repeated, John O'Keefe was never inside their home. Every one of these facts is true in the narrow sense that it happened. What each of them means has been contested at every step, and no one from that house has ever been charged with any crime connected to John's death. And then, in June of 2024, the trial arrived at the witness everyone had been waiting for. Trooper Michael Proctor, the lead investigator, the man whose work the entire case rested on. What happened during his testimony is not disputed by anyone, because it happened in open court, on the record, with the cameras running. Proctor was made to read aloud, to the jury and to the world, text messages he had sent about Karen Reed while he was investigating her, messages sent to his friends, to his colleagues, even to his supervisors. In them, he mocked her body. He called her names so crude that he had to apologize from the stand as he read them. Vulgar, degrading insults aimed at the woman whose freedom depended on the fairness of his work. He joked to friends about searching through the private photos on her seized phone, remarking that he had found no nude pictures yet. And in one message, he wrote that he hoped she would take her own life. He also texted, in the earliest days of the case, reassurances that the homeowner, a fellow officer, wouldn't face trouble. Proctor insisted from the stand that his crude words were regrettable, but that the investigation itself was honest, that he had followed the evidence, that unprofessional language did not mean a corrupted case. The prosecution still believed in its evidence. But something in the room had shifted, and everyone felt it. The lead investigator had become, in the space of an afternoon, the defense's best witness. The lawyers gave their closing arguments in late June, and the jury went out. They deliberated for days. Notes came back to the judge, speaking of deep and irreconcilable division. And on July 1st, 2024, Judge Beverly Cannon declared a mistrial. A hung jury. After more than 2 years and 8 weeks of testimony, the Commonwealth versus Karen Reed had ended in no verdict at all. Except, as it turned out, that wasn't quite the whole story either. In the days after the mistrial, jurors began to come forward quietly through lawyers, and what they reported startled everyone. The jury, they said, had not been deadlocked on everything. On the charge of second-degree murder, they had been unanimous, 12-0, not guilty. On leaving the scene, the same, not guilty. Their disagreement had been confined to the manslaughter charge alone, but no one had asked them, and no partial verdict had been taken. And so it had all dissolved into mistrial together. Karen's lawyers seized on this, arguing that trying her again for murder, a charge 12 jurors had already rejected, would violate the ancient rule against double jeopardy. They fought that battle up through the Massachusetts courts and all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Every court declined to stop the retrial. The verdicts, the judges reasoned, had never been announced in open court. And so, in the eyes of the law, they had never happened. The district attorney's office announced it would try Karen Reed again, on all of it, and this time they reached outside their own office, hiring a prominent private defense attorney named Hank Brennan, a man who had once represented the gangster Whitey Bulger, to come in as a special prosecutor and take over the case. So as 2024 turned to 2025, Canton braced itself once more. The pink signs came out of garages. The satellite trucks booked their hotel rooms in Dedham. And Karen Reed, 3 years after that snowy morning, prepared to stand trial for her life a second time. That second trial, and the verdict that finally came, is where our story goes next. If this story helped you unwind tonight, take a second to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss part 2. The rest of Karen's story is still waiting, and it will be here whenever you're ready to rest again. Good night.